Rick, how you doing,
I'm
man?
doing great. Keith, how are you?
Good. I'm doing great, man.
Good, good.
You know, you had a great idea for today's show, which was let's kind of define what the practice is. And all the podcasts we do, we talk about this routine or ritual that we do on a regular basis, and we've come to call it the practice. And so why don't we start by defining what that is to the audience, what it means to our lives and things like that. You want to kick it off?
I do, but I think maybe even before we do that, I think it might be kind of fun to talk about why the practice has helped us and how it's different in our lives now than what it was before we started that.
Okay, great.
So let me start with that. I think I began studying this a long time ago, probably 10 or 15 years ago. I didn't implement it though because it took a long time and I didn't know quite how to do it and I didn't really have anybody to talk to about it. So if you took a snapshot of what my life looked like 15 years ago, I was probably working 12 to 15 hours a day, probably like most of you. Worried about my mortgage payment, my car payments, not worried, but making sure that I kept the income going to make sure I made them on time, that my wife was comfortable, that we were still able to travel. And I was cutting corners on a few things. I was also being very aggressive on taking tax deductions so I could net more money. And the worst part of it for me was as I did harder and harder work with more and more on my plate, I took less and less time for myself and got to the point where I was about 40 pounds, 50 pounds overweight. And I was on a what I call a coffee alcohol cycle. Get up in the morning and have 3 cups of coffee and then drink a whole pot during the day. And then when I knocked off at 6 or 7 at night, the cocktail started, wine with dinner, after dinner drink, and then boom, into bed and probably drunk while I'm hitting the pillow. So that wasn't getting me anywhere, and I felt really, really horrible. And that led to other things too. It led to me trying to find meaning outside of myself. I started to flirt with other women. I started to look up old girlfriends, start doing the calls at night, you know, when I'm halfway in the bag, doing the memory lane thing. It was a cry for help that I didn't realize that I needed to come back to myself. All of that had to do with anxiety, had to do with guilt, had to do with feeling like I was empty in my life, and I was. So that's where I was, and that's not where I am now, and then we'll talk about how I account for the difference in a minute. How about you?
You know, my my life before the practice was similar to yours in a way. You know, it was, you know, I wasn't a coffee drinker and, you know, I didn't drink wine or anything. However, I had some other, you know, routines that I went through that I was unaware of. And mine was mostly going through this dating cycle. You know, like you, I was achievement and goal oriented. And I was really focused on, you know, realizing some goals that I set for myself regarding income that I was going to earn during my lifetime, you know, more, you know, in that year that was going to result in retiring with this much money, you know, the next material thing that I could acquire, you know, everything to kind of make me feel good about myself in some kind of way, to point to some kind of success that was achieved. And the more and more I did that, it was never enough. It was never satisfying. So that's what my life looked like during prior to the practice. And not to mention that I really hurt a lot of people along the way. And I thought that it was all about personal growth and personal development. I thought I was on that track at different times. I remember reading Tony Robbins' book, which at that time in my life, while I was in the last year of the military, I thought that, man, this is exactly all there is to, attending to this other part of myself to be fully realized, to be a fully whole person, so to speak.
Sure.
And I guess although I hadn't heard the term self-actualized, I guess that's what I thought it was. It wasn't. It wasn't even close to it. It was more just achievement oriented teaching and steps to acquire more, try to be more, And while I'm not knocking it, it was what I could hear at that time in my life, and there was just more suffering. It was just never enough. And I hurt a lot of people along the way. It wasn't intentional. Like, I didn't set out to hurt anyone that I dated. I didn't set out to step on anyone as I climbed the corporate ladder. I didn't set out to do any of that. As a matter of fact, I thought I was kind of kind in my business and professional relationships. However, I was blind in my personal relationships with the people that I dated. So it was a lot of suffering. And even then, I felt hurt along the way. And it was once I got to the other side of it that I just looked back at like all the suffering that went on. And it was a ton of it.
I think part of what happens to us, especially if you're high achievers, you work, and then you feel like you're entitled to all of the fruits of your labor. And if you can't afford them, you put them on charge cards or you finance or whatever. And so as long as we have the badges of success, then we are supposed to feel successful. At some point, though, that doesn't work that way. At some point, it becomes dysfunctional. And for me, that's how I came into ToBeRe. I wanted to get back into shape physically. And as I got back into shape and experienced ToBeRe, and we did the sharing at that point, which I had never done before, I started to think there's a lot more here than what I realized. And I found that I was craving being around other people at ToBeRe because they were healthy, they were interested in improving themselves physically, but more importantly, they all had issues that they were working on, and I didn't feel so isolated because I had issues myself. And so that became a real eye-opener. So from that point of view, I started to really delve into all sorts of things. Some were blind alleys, some weren't. That led to a practice that I now maintain, and it's been amazing. The key to this, the whole keystone for this development in my life, has been the notion that you cannot expect validation from anything or anyone outside of yourself. You cannot expect validation from anyone or anything outside of yourself. It's here. It's all here. Everything is in here. I'm not talking about being selfish and acquiring things. I'm talking about self-knowledge, self-improvement, self-development. It's all a creature of inside of you. That's number one. And for me, number two is I'm attached to everything else in the universe. Every part of life I am part of as well. And the reason why that's important is when you start looking at people as different than you, you can find all kinds of reasons why we're superior. Our egos will start working to show us why we're better than other people. And that separation, the idea that you're different than me and I'm better, is what gets us into enormous amounts of trouble. If you rather look at it like everybody who's alive, everything that's alive, is animated by the same life force, animated by the same life force, you have a totally different view of where you fit into that. We're all subject to those same rules of life, as a bug, as a wolf, as a human being. We just happen to be at the top of the food chain. So those are a few little tidbits that led to a practice that I now follow that has a lot to do with looking outside of myself, pulling back, detaching from Rick's efforts, looking at Rick as a player without judging Rick, without judging the things that happened to him, just taking a 10,000-foot view of who I am, detaching from whatever the outcome might be, still working as hard as I can within it, but not judging myself and being mindful every moment that the present unit of my life is this moment and nothing more. I'm not worrying about tomorrow. I don't give a damn about last week. I can't change it. It's right here, and I'm living my life fully in that moment. Last point. For me, the biggest improvement in my life has been understanding the importance of breath, more important than food, in my judgment. The importance of breath and breathing, and secondly, the importance of daily, not weekly, daily meditation. And it's not that hard, honestly, it is not. Part of the practice is failing at it, and I still fail at it all the time. But the idea with meditation is you're creating space for the opportunity of things to come to you that are unconscious, things that are within you that will come up naturally. And the idea isn't to try to control or to suppress, it's the idea to hold space for yourself. We'll talk more about that in a moment. How about you?
Man, preach, man. You had me just captivated, man. I was present.
Oh, that's right. You're always present. I really love that.
I didn't know I was going to be called on.
Oh,
I was kind of caught up. So
I didn't want to hog this thing.
Man, I was preach, man. To hog it. Yeah, I can relate and I agree and connect with everything that you said there. The practice for me became necessary because I was being self-destructive in my life. And I could have continued to try to do the same old things that I've done, and they would have produced a lot of what I had, become used to. Mm-hmm. Relationship ended, it was in tatters, I played a major role in it getting to that point, like that same old thing that I lived many, many times before. The ups and downs of business, going back out there on the hunt, on the chase when a deal was completed, on to the next thing. And I just got sick and tired of that roller coaster ride, and I wanted something different. And I looked at my age, here I am 45, and I've got a routine in place, but this routine that I have in place, I'm physically fit, I'm healthy, knock on wood, I'm polite, I'm mannerable, I have manners, I'm considerate of other people and thoughtful, I remember people's names really well,
Yes, you do.
all that stuff that I was checking all those boxes, but that way of doing things had taken me so far, and that was no longer going to be enough because suffering was still coming with it. It wasn't like I was experiencing life in a different way. It wasn't like I just wasn't conscious, and so I had to do something different, and suffering became my spiritual teacher. I mean, God knows there were enough people along the way that were incredible teachers to me, but I wasn't in a place to where I could hear them at that point with what they were trying to teach me. And they were loving, and they were like, listen, I can't stick around for this cat right here because he brings suffering with him. And so, kindly and lovingly, they just kind of let me go. They just kind of, detached and let me go, as they should have, because I was not in a place to where I was going to bring anything to their life. And if they had a practice of accepting me as I was at that moment, they did it beautifully. And they just let me, we're going to just let him stay here. And if he chooses to evolve, he can join back with us down the road. And, I really appreciate them letting me go. Back then, my ego's like, you've been abandoned. There's no abandoned. I was an anchor. I was going to drag those people down that I was dating. So they did the right thing, but the suffering became it for me, and I knew that I had to do something different. And it began with a practice. And
so practice for me involves the idea of doing things intentionally and consciously, not doing them because they're automatic, and not doing them because they're expected, and not doing them because it will bring some sort of external material reward. Very difficult thing to do, and if you're married, your spouse probably has to be on board with this, or you have to have an understanding with your spouse that there's going to be times when you're going to be self-treating or self-medicating with meditation, or not being able to do things that have been expected. I don't think that's necessarily a deal breaker, but I do think it requires some open communication about where you're at and where your spouse is and what the expectations of each party are. So consciousness means the opposite of running your life on automatic pilot. You don't do things because you've always done them. You don't, for example, in my life, I hate talking on the phone. I think it's just a total waste of time. Unless it's to say, okay, instead of 4 o'clock, I'll be there at 4:30. That's why I like texting, because you don't have to go through, hi, how are you? Is your kid okay? Did your mom make it to the... I mean, we do that and it makes us feel important and it makes us feel like we're really caring, but we're not. We're basically, when that person stops talking, what does the next person say? Oh yeah, and my mom is doing fine too, and so you're basically having monologues, but you're just exchanging information in the air. It's just your monologue and my monologue. We're not communicating. It's just a chance for me to talk about my life, you to talk about your life. I don't want that. I want something, I don't want to talk about the drapes. I want to talk about things that are important to me. Things that are important have to do with experiences that we've had that are unique or different, that bring us closer to an understanding of why we're on the planet, what our mission might be in life, how we can help other people, why I'm so selfish all the time, how come I can't get my head out of my ass. I want to talk about stuff like that because we all as humans experience it. We don't. We talk about the drapes, and I hate that. So I am very difficult to get by phone because I don't like the small talk. Even if you don't talk small, that's just a habit I have. So consciousness for me is living life on purpose with as minimal amount of time spent on minutia that's unimportant to me as possible. And secondly, it's an idea of trying to figure out what all this is about, how I relate to it, what my role in life is, what I'm supposed to be doing, what I want to be doing, and if they're conflict, how to resolve those two. And then lastly, I would say the practice has to do with being mindful, being compassionate, being loving, being not judging. Because if you're any of those things, they come back and bite you. Those are the things that bite you. You think you're being cool by pointing out that that person is doing this and isn't it terrible? No, that very comment is the thing that's going to cause you pain in your heart. You don't realize it, but it will. The more judgmental you are, the more you will be judged. And by God, none of us can afford to be judged.
I agree, Rick. The practice for me, it has been just what you said, man, not being on automatic pilot. And I've had to come up with a few things that help me stay in the present moment. Otherwise, my mind will go somewhere else. So I have to anchor myself into it. So when I have conversations with people, I go into the things like, okay, you need to be able to recall what's been said to you. And it's not about how strong is my memory. It's a test for me to see if I was present for that connection. If I was present with this other being who happens to be having a human experience like I'm having a human experience. So it's almost, it becomes this way for me to root myself in that moment. So like, for example, people say like, I'm horrible with names or I'm horrible with this. I'm really good with names. What I'm really not good with is checking, staying present for a conversation that I've heard 1,000 times about something that my mind tells me is trivial. Oh, you still having the same tire problem with your coworker? Like, I'm over that. Or you still talking about interior design that really doesn't solve the problem of there not being any kind of civility between human beings in this world. Like, checking out of that and thinking that what I think is important to talk about is more important than you talking about it. So my thing is how do I stay rooted and anchored in that moment, even when I don't think the conversation is one that elevates us. That and practicing not judging, like that's really the big thing for me, is looking for opportunities to practice being kind, to be non-judgmental, as you said, which is so important. It becomes that.
Tell them about what you do in the morning. This is so impressive because it's not only unusual, but I can see how that causes you to focus on finding things in your inner life that are more important to you than going through the world talking about nonsense.
You know, I've kind of talked about in bits and pieces about what my normal morning routine is. I think it's really important that I share why I do it. I think that I've always said I'm going to be a really kind person. I want to really, be healthy and stuff like that. And me being healthy physically and fit, I'm this way because I'm deliberate about what I do every single day. I take no days off with how I eat. I take no days off with being active and being in movement. Like there's no days off with that for me. What I was doing was, while I had this great goal, vision for the kind of person I wanted to be, I was taking days off left and right. And while one workout will last me for that entire day, taking days off with practicing mindfulness or only doing it for this little sliver of time when it just life gives you many, many opportunities during the day to practice it, you can't take any time off. Like you can't. And I was taking time off all the time, and my life was reflecting me missing it. Like you miss a couple days in the gym, or you have some days where you don't eat healthy, your body will show you that you miss those days, and so will your life experience. It will be filled with suffering when you take days off. And so I was taking days off. So mine was more out of necessity that I began doing this practice, and I stopped talking about it, and I started to be about it. Mm-hmm. And when I see my friends who are super healthy, but I see them, man, just gripped in anxiousness. I see them, worrying all the time, and they are just inundated with obsessive thinking. And I see that, man, my heart goes out to them because I can completely relate, because I live that life.
Sure do.
And you don't have to. And so what's different is simple. No mindfulness practice on a consistent basis. That's the only thing that separates me, this Keith, from the Keith of 4 years ago, is that I don't miss a single day now. Like, it's not an option. And those things are, first thing in the morning, I go through a gratitude practice because it roots me in that present moment. What am I grateful for, either that happened the night before, and by the way, I do a gratitude practice right before I close my eyes at night and go to bed, but I do one in the morning too. And sometimes it may recount the things of the night before, like, man, I am super grateful that Prius made that drive. It's 11 years old with 180,000 miles on it. Man, I'm grateful for that. Yeah. Or I'm grateful, man, that when I got out of bed and put these 10 toes on the floor, I mean, I felt movement in them. Like, so I go through what I'm grateful for, and grateful for the opportunities that day to practice being kind. So I go through those 5 things first. And then the second thing I do is I read this book, The Mayo Clinic Guide to Stress-Free Living. It reminds me of one of the things I need to be present to that day. And that is, the mind has a negative bias. It's going to look for what to improve in other people, what's wrong about them, what's wrong with life in today. So just be aware. I got to be reminded of that, because if I don't, I'll go down and get, sucked into a black hole and that old kind of behavior. Then the next thing I do is I bring some movement into my day while I'm listening to a podcast. So I'll put a podcast on with Tara Brach, which is one of the people that you introduced me to Eckhart Tolle, to Wayne Dyer, or I'll listen to one of our old podcasts, not because, I'm like trying to give us more shine, but I just really think that what we're talking about and sharing are things that we've learned from other people and things that we practice today that are timeless. Yeah. So I'll do that while I'm doing some stretching, while I'm doing some push-ups and some air squats, because I want to bring the physical part of movement into my day, because it awakens my body, and I can hear with heightened attention to the message of the podcast when my body is awake and alert. So that's part of my practice, and I find myself being mindful throughout the day when I begin my day like this. So I began this 4 years ago, and I have not missed a day. Some days, it's rare, but I may only get 2 or 3 hours of sleep. But let me tell you what will not be missed that day is that practice. Because I feel like if I begin or take on the day without it, that, man, I am going into the day, missing my starters. It's like fielding a team without my starters.
The morning practice is so important for people. It's something that a lot of folks hit that snooze alarm and then roll over and fight with themselves, get out of bed, and then they're out the door, and they don't
make time for it.
Don't make time, and they're back on the treadmill, right on the rat wheel again. I think that the morning practice is huge. Whatever you do for your morning practice has to be enormous.
So what you're saying is that the mind will tell you when you're running late that you don't have time for it.
Yeah.
And what you were saying is, You don't have time not to get
Not
it
to
in.
do it. Yeah, and it's so easy, but it's something that is not habitual, and therefore it's ignored. Or we think, oh, I'm not as important as getting to work at X hour, as I should be more motivated because I'm making this money, or this is a big deal, or whatever. Well, then get up earlier, or just do something to make sure you have time reserved for yourself.
And like, it's that important.
It's that important. The morning routine for me in particular, this is by research, there was a JAMA article about the Journal of American Medical Association, had an article about the psychological, emotional importance of the first 26 seconds when you wake up. And the notion is that when you wake up, that first 26 seconds, before you've had an opportunity to develop defense mechanisms about who you are, what your day is, what your problems are, before any of that crap shows up, that first pure 26-second segment bubbles up things that you're really concerned about in your life. Pay attention to that. So my practice is I wait for the 26 seconds to pass, and then I try to prioritize the 3 or 4 things that came up during that 26 seconds. Sometimes it's beautiful thoughts. Sometimes it's stuff that I feel bad about and I can't change, but at least it tells you what you're pointed at. The second thing that's important for me is nature. One of the reasons I moved to Sedona was I wanted to be away from traffic. I wanted to be away from congestion. I wanted to be away from lines of people. I wanted to be away from the human experience. Remember, I'm a lawyer, and I spent 40 years dealing with other people's problems. I'm not complaining. I made a good living at it. But remember, lawyers are nothing more than glorified garbage men. You know, you drive up your truck of problems and dump it on my doorstep, and I got to deal with it. And I'm not complaining, but that's the nature of law, and it's aggressive. I was a trial lawyer. It's aggressive. It's fighting. I didn't want any more of that. And I found I was being less effective as a lawyer because my personal development was such I wanted to compromise. I was no longer aggressive. I didn't have the fight in me. I just couldn't do it any longer. So I moved to Sedona to be with nature. So after I do my 26 seconds and I get dressed, almost every day I'm outside. I'm doing a hike somewhere, and I'm doing a walking meditation with my hike. And my walking meditation is to be as blank as possible, to allow all of life to fill me and to be directed in a way that makes the most sense for the most people, including myself at the top of the list. And that's what I think about every day. And then I, throughout the day, do other exercises. I also do a lot of reading, and I do teaching, and I do volunteer work. And those are the things that cause me over and over again to be grateful, to be thankful. And finally, like you, at the end of the day, I conclude with 5 things that I'm most grateful for, and also 3 things that I'm very proud that I did, and 3 things that I need to try to improve on for the next day, without judging me. I don't say to myself, boy, you were really stupid when you said, I don't say that. I say, I could have handled that interchange I had with Steve a little more gently, because I know it made him feel badly, and I wasn't in that much of a hurry, but I just didn't have patience, so I got to work on that tomorrow, that kind of thing. And then lastly, I would say that I always have to remind myself, I'm not important, and it's all going away.
God, I love that. And it's true.
It's so true. And at 70, could be tomorrow.
At 49, it could be tomorrow.
It could be tomorrow, brother.
I want to say this, while we wrap up. I mentioned like all the people that I care about and all the people that cared about me over the years and these are people that have done the practice, and they were doing the practice on a daily basis. Like, they really don't take a day off. And I know they looked at me and they were like, man, this guy's just over there suffering, and what he can do this little bit every single day, but he's not doing it every day, and hence here's his suffering. And they met me with compassion. I'm sure there were some people like, I'm out, like I can't watch this anymore, it's painful. And there were other people that looked at me with compassion, and they understood that I was incapable of outbehaving my current level of consciousness at that time, of what my practice was. So they weren't surprised that I was filled with anxiousness or obsessive thinking or judging and blaming. They were not surprised by it. because I wasn't consistently practicing doing something different. And literally it really came down to me consistently practicing something different, practicing meditation, practicing gratitude, practicing being kind. Why is gratitude so important? Because when you practice gratitude, you can't be anxious at the same time. You can't be worried at the same time that you're practicing gratitude. It's impossible. So had I cultivated that more, I would have had a different life experience. And it was really important that I began to change my circumstance by doing something very simple. That these 5 or 10 moments of the day, you know, people say own the day. It's not just owning a day in an aggressive, assertive, way that here's my to-do list. These are all the things I'm going to do. I'm going to make these 10 phone calls. That's important, and it serves its own purpose with achieving whatever goals you have for that day or for that quarter. Maybe. There's probably suffering to come with it if you don't have a different kind of practice that is one about being present, being conscious. And when I started to incorporate that in my life, all the other things just started to fall away.
That's so cool.
It just fell away.
Cool.
And so I began to do this for myself, and I hope for my friends who know what to do. It's not a question of knowing what to do, it's actual doing it. It's important that for those 5 or 10 minutes a day, minimum, you have to do it. You really do.
You have to be conscious, in other words.
You have to be conscious.
Just be conscious of that moment and be in that moment fully without thinking about what else you got to do or what horrible thing happened the last 5 minutes. Conscious in that moment only.
Right, and do those things that support you being conscious. Rick has mentioned that the 26 seconds and what he does after that by observing his thoughts and then getting out in nature and then wrapping the day up with some reading and some gratitude. I mentioned mine, what mine are, but doing those things deliberately because they support you being conscious.
Yes, exactly. And that's something that you find that is important just because you're recognizing you are important to yourself. It's not something you're picking up your kids, you're getting your husband's or your wife's flowers or whatever. It's for you, and it's only a few moments. You have to take it. Keith said something really important, and it's the distinction between reading a book about how to do a great exercise routine, how to do RT, and doing the RT. You're going to make mistakes doing the RT, but you got to get on the floor and lift the weights. There's no other way to it. One other thing I think that we ought to touch on, and that is that all of us who are watching this are very similar. We've all had tough jobs. We've all had conflicts. We are involved in things all the time that are competing for our interests. We have way too much to do. Life is going crazy. It's out of control. We've all experienced that, and some are continuing to experience it more than others. And we've been successful competing in that arena. So I would just point out that if you looked at all the reasons why you're successful, you followed rules, and those rules are like a yardstick. If you had a yardstick that's 3 feet long, the rules that you have mastered, that you're really, really good at, account for 2 feet, 11.5 inches of that yardstick. What you're shitty at is the last ½ inch. And that's why you feel anxious and you feel guilty or you feel tired or you feel like something's missing in your life. And that last ½ inch, you'll get when you become conscious.
Exactly.
When you live your life in a conscious way and let go of the things that you can't change and be compassionate and loving.
Exactly. That ½ inch is the most important increment of that yardstick. And it took me a lot of years to get there, despite everyone's best efforts of trying to get me to slow down and do it. That's the part that was the most important. So hopefully we define what the practice is. We've talked about what our life was before and now during the practice and how it looks and how it feels and those things. And hopefully it resonates, and it is our humble, wish and hope for you that you will incorporate a practice in your life that works for you, that brings you to being conscious and present so you can be your best. And we're all connected. There is no separation between us and the next being. We're all one.
And feel loved, self-love, and feel peaceful in your heart. And we'll put some things for you in the show notes that have helped each of us that might be of interest to you as well.
Cool. Thanks, Rick.
I love you, buddy.
I love you, man. Thank you.